Hello and welcome to Jason's Macintosh Museum. I'm Jason, your host, and today I'd like to go over some of the common problems and issues that you may encounter with the early Macintosh PowerBook series, specifically the 100 series of PowerBooks. Now, when I say the 100 series, what I mean is really any PowerBook whose model number starts with a 1, although there are some exceptions. The models I'm referring to specifically all share this style of case, and this case was used on the PowerBook 140, 145, 145B, 150, 160, 165, 170 and 180. So all those models used this style of case. Now there was of course the PowerBook 100 which looked similar, but the case was completely different. And there was also a PowerBook 190 series, but that was also a completely different style of case. So what are some of the problems? Well, the first thing I'd like to talk about is batteries. All of the PowerBook 100 series use this type of battery. It's a nickel-cadmium rechargeable battery, very similar to the style of battery that you would find in almost any laptop of that time. Apple did use lead-acid batteries on the portable and the PowerBook 100, but all the models after that, up until I believe the PowerBook 190 and 5300 series, were nickel-cadmium. Now, as you probably know with nickel-cadmium batteries, as they age, they simply fail to hold a charge. And of course you have the dreaded memory effect with Ni-Cads, where if you don't run them low often enough, you won't get the full capacity out of them. But there's a more serious problem with this type of battery that I found, which is that if you leave one of these batteries inside a PowerBook for a very long period of time, say when it's being stored, the battery can leak and can start to corrode the battery terminals inside the PowerBook itself. Now, of course, anyone who knows anything about old desktop Macs knows that you always take out the CMOS battery out of them if you're going to be storing them, because they do leak and corrode over time. But so do these Ni-Cads, which was quite surprising to me at first. And I only found this out because one of the PowerBooks that I had in storage, when I pulled the battery out, it had completely corroded the terminals away, both on the battery and in the PowerBook itself, which meant the PowerBook could no longer use a working battery because the terminals had corroded away. And I have a battery that I'll show you in a moment that has this problem. So here we have a standard Macintosh PowerBook Ni-Cad battery, and on the face of it, it looks to be just fine. There's no problems there, except if you look at the terminals, and you can see what's happened. This battery was stored inside a PowerBook for a long period of time in a discharged state, and you can see that the terminals have almost completely corroded away, but this also corroded the terminals inside the PowerBook itself. So it's very important, if you have one of these PowerBooks, don't leave the battery inside it. Keep the battery out until you need to use it. And another problem these batteries have, which is again not obvious unless you look at it from the side, if you look at the case, you can see how it's bulged out. And it's quite obvious, in fact, if you put the battery onto a table, well, like this, notice how easily it spins. And that's because the top section has bulged out, which means the battery won't sit flat on a table. So you do the little spin test. Whereas if I compare that to a good battery, just have to remove the latch from it. This is a good battery, and you can see that it doesn't want to spin like the other one does, because this battery, not having bulged, still has a perfectly flat casing. Now the next issue with these particular models of PowerBooks concerns the case, and specifically the door on the back of the case. So we just this up, slide this around, and you can see I'm referring to this door, which covers all of the ports on the back. Now, having the door was, in theory, a very good idea because it meant that all the ports were covered when they weren't in use and also makes the back end look a lot cleaner and less cluttered. But there was a problem in that the power switch that you need to press, obviously, to turn the PowerBook on was behind the door. Because remember that these PowerBooks could not be turned on simply by pressing a key on the keyboard. You had to use the power switch. And because the power switch lived behind the door, as you can see, it's the button just here, it means that every time you wanted to turn the PowerBook on, you had to open this door. And that resulted in the door simply breaking off due to the plastic cracking and fatiguing over time. Sometimes the little locking tab, you can see a little locking tab here, would sometimes break off, which meant that the door would close but it wouldn't stay latched in the closed position. Or what would happen more often is that the tabs which secure the door to the back panel, there's a tab on that side and a tab on that side, would simply snap off, which means that the door would not stay connected at all. So, of course, most PowerBooks that you see these days simply don't have the door on them at all. So it's actually probably a good sign that if your PowerBook still has the original door on it and it still functions, it probably hasn't been used very much. Now, the third problem I want to talk about also concerns the case, but specifically it focuses on the screen hinge mechanism. Now, on most laptops, even though the outer casing is made of plastic, there's often a very, very strong metal chassis inside it that is used to keep all the components together and also used to provide strength for the screen hinge. It's often called a stiffener or a chassis, something like that. And in fact, later model PowerBooks like the 5300 series and the 190 series did in fact have a case stiffener like that. But the 100 series of PowerBooks did not. What Apple simply did was that they affixed the screen hinge on both sides to basically the plastic casing. Now, the way they did that was to use special threaded inserts that were molded into the plastic. So the idea is the only way that you can put a metal screw into plastic is to have some kind of threaded insert in the plastic that the screw can screw into and mate with. So that's what they did here. They put threaded inserts into the back panel of the screen. So they put threaded inserts here, here, here and here, which the hinge screws, one here, and there's another one behind here and behind here, they screwed straight into that. And so the hinge flap was actually sandwiched between the two halves of the upper display bezel. Now, that seemed like a perfectly acceptable solution. But what Apple didn't foresee was that the plastic would become very brittle with age. It wasn't so much usage, although usage did play a part, but simply as the plastics aged, they lost their ability to flex. And what would happen is every time you opened and closed the screen hinge on a PowerBook 100 series, you would apply force to those threaded inserts just in behind here. And when the plastic was new, it could handle that flexing without a problem. But as the plastic aged, the threaded inserts that were molded into the plastic around them would start to crack and fall away, which meant the insert had nothing to grab onto. The end result was you had a very loose screen hinge, and it got to the point on some PowerBooks where the entire screen would break away from the hinge, and you basically had a screen that was unusable. But this problem didn't just affect the screen hinge, it also affected the internal structure of the PowerBook itself, because all the other internal components also used metal screws that threaded into metal inserts molded into the case plastics. And what I'll do to illustrate this, this problem is I have a bottom panel from another PowerBook which had this problem occur, and so I'll show you what it looks like. So here we have a bottom panel from a Macintosh PowerBook. I think this is from a PowerBook 160, and you can see that if we zoom in on the areas where the threaded inserts are supposed to be, you can see that here is a threaded insert that is still in position. So you can see what they did. They simply put a threaded insert into a plastic moulding. Oops, so come on, stay there, stay there. And so the screw, the metal screw, would screw into this to hold everything together. But if you look to the right of it, you can see that the threaded insert here is missing, and that's because the plastic around the insert has become brittle and broken away. And you can see the same thing over here. That one's broken away, and over here, that one's also broken away. And in fact, there's a few more on this one. That one's still intact by the looks of it, but it's also starting to break away. You can actually see how the plastic around the insert is starting to crack. And let's see, what else have we got? That one's still okay. And I think that's it. But you can see that once the threaded inserts, once the plastic around the inserts starts to crack, the first problem is that you won't be able to tighten the screw, because what will happen is that the insert will start to spin relative to the plastic casing, which means you won't be able to tighten the screw. And at that point, it's just a matter of time before the insert breaks away completely from the plastic. So the only fix for this is to, if you still have the threaded inserts, to try and use some kind of epoxy glue to try and glue them back into place. But to be honest, that doesn't really work very well. So this PowerBook, for example, I've used it for parts because the bottom case on this was simply in such a bad state that I wouldn't be able to properly reassemble it. And it's not just the threaded inserts, in fact. These holes here are holes where the bottom case screws go through to hold the two halves of the lower casing together. And I've even seen these plastic towers crack and break. That's mainly due to somebody who was reassembling the PowerBook over tightening the case screws. And that's why it's important, if you were working on a PowerBook 100 series, when you're working with these screws, do not over tighten them, because that is a surefire way to break or crack the plastic around these inserts. So if your PowerBook is still holding together just fine and all the screws and threaded inserts are in good condition, when you're reassembling, just take great care and do not over tighten those screws. Now the next series of problems with the PowerBook 100 series concern the display, and there are actually several different problems that can occur depending on the type of display that your PowerBook has. First of all, the active matrix displays that were used on the PowerBook 170 and 180 have a very common problem, which in fact I've illustrated in my demonstration video on the PowerBook 170, so if you haven't watched that, please do so. But the issue is that when the display has been running for more than, say, 10 or 15 minutes, the corners of the display will start to darken noticeably, and the darkness starts to spread from all four corners slowly towards the center of the display. And as a result, that affects the display's legibility quite a bit. Now, unfortunately, there's no real fix for this condition. There's speculation as to what the cause could be, and it's often believed that It's simply moisture being trapped within the layers of the LCD panel, which is certainly quite plausible. Some people have even tried to take the display out of the PowerBook and actually put it in a very low oven to try and heat it up in order to drive out any moisture that might have accumulated in the display. But of course, the risk you run there is damaging the display permanently and the LCD panel permanently because of the heat. So there's really nothing you can do about that. The other issue you may have, which often affects the passive matrix displays used on the PowerBook 140, 160 and 145, is that the display will be completely black when you power it on. So you'll start the PowerBook up, it will chime, it will boot, but the display, the backlight will turn on, but the display itself remains completely black. Now, this is down to electrolytic capacitors in the display going bad. And thankfully there is a fix for that, but the fix involves having to take the display apart and change, I think there's 6 of them, change 6 electrolytic capacitors on the inverter board or the controller board that runs alongside the display, which you can do, but the capacitors themselves have to be very small because there's not a lot of clearance within the display housing. But that is the solution to that problem. The other issue you may encounter is a situation where either the backlight won't turn on, or it turns on and off randomly, or for example, the contrast control, if you have a passive matrix display, doesn't give you the proper range of contrast adjustment. And that's also down to electrolytic capacitors going bad, but those capacitors that go bad are actually in the display inverter board, which sits just below the brightness and contrast controls. And if you're wondering exactly where the board is, have a look at the disassembly video of the PowerBook 170 to find out. But again, if you change the capacitors on that board or change the board altogether, that will normally solve that problem. And the final issue that I'd like to discuss on the PowerBook 100 series regards the trackball. Now, there are a couple of problems with the trackball. First of all, the trackball may become very stiff to operate, or it may not, it may even fail to move the mouse pointer at all, or maybe in one direction. Now, the fix for that is quite simple. That's simply a consequence of dirt and grease accumulating inside the trackball mechanism. But it's very easy to fix. You simply remove this outer ring by rotating it to pull the ring off. You can then take the ball out of the trackball mechanism, and you can clean the rollers and guides inside. So that's not really a big deal. The other issue that I've come across, though, is the buttons for the trackball becoming very loose. And the reason that happens is that these buttons are connected to the surrounding panel by nothing more than flexible plastic connections. In other words, to allow the trackball buttons to physically move a slight amount, as they must in order to operate, Apple simply extended small pieces of plastic and welded those to the underside of the surrounding panel. Now, the only issue there is that if the trackball has had a lot of use, if the buttons have had a lot of use, then over time that plastic will fatigue and break, which results in the trackball button itself becoming detached or partially detached from the panel and feeling loose. Now, I believe you can possibly glue those back into place. I haven't tried it myself, but the fix would be, if you can, to find a replacement lower top cover or top cover, this part here. But of course, these old PowerBooks are becoming very, very, very hard to find these days. But thankfully, all of the PowerBook models that I've mentioned previously, as in the 140, 145, 145B, 150, 160, 165, 170, 180, all use the same case. They all use the same keyboard, I believe, and the same trackball. So you can interchange parts between all these different models. Having said it, of course, the displays are different between models. I do believe the PowerBook 140 and 145 and 145B use the same display. I know the 170 uses a unique display. The 180 uses a unique display. And I'm not sure about the 160. I'm not sure what that uses. I'd have to find out. And I know the PowerBook 150 does use a unique display as well. So interchanging displays between the models is a little bit more difficult. And before I go, there is actually one other problem that I should mention, which I've seen on a couple of PowerBooks, although it's not as common as you might think. And it has to do with the power connector at the back. And in fact, this is a common problem with all sorts of laptops, in that the power adapter socket is soldered to the main board of the laptop, but there's no extra reinforcement. So over time, with normal use, or certainly if the power adapter plug has been jolted or knocked while it's in position, you can actually break the solder connections between the socket and the main board, which means, of course, that when you plug in the power adapter, the battery won't charge and the laptop won't power on. It's a fairly simple fix, though. If you take the PowerBook apart and remove the main board, you can easily resolder those connections. But wait, there's more. There's one final point I'd like to make also about the power adapters that are used with these PowerBooks. Apple came out with several different plug packs or AC adapters for these PowerBooks, mainly because the higher end PowerBooks, especially those with a color display, needed more current. They drew more current from their AC adapter. Now, that's not normally an issue, but if, for example, you have a PowerBook 100 series with a color display, either a 165C or a 180C, you have to use a special power adapter, and it looks like this. So the power adapter in question looks the same as any other PowerBook 100 AC adapter from here, but if you look at the plug, you'll see that on the plug is physically larger and has, if you can see that, 24 watts written on the end. So that indicates that this is a high power or high current AC adapter designed for use with the color screened PowerBook 100s. But I believe you can still use it on other PowerBook models. However, I do believe that if you try and use this high power or high current adapter with either the PowerBook 100 or 150, you can cause damage. So I would play it safe, and on all the PowerBooks, apart from the color screen models, use the standard grey PowerBook power adapter, but on the 165C and 180C, you have to use one of these. So for those of you who have a Macintosh PowerBook 100 series laptop, I hope you found this video informative, and thank you for watching.